Welcome back to the channel. If you are just joining us, pull up a chair because what is unfolding right now in a quiet suburb of New York is one of the most politically charged, historically significant, and deeply controversial events in recent American memory. We are talking about a sitting congressional investigation, a former Secretary of State and First Lady sitting down for a closed-door deposition, a former President of the United States scheduled to follow her tomorrow, and all of it tied to the name that has haunted the halls of power for years now, Jeffrey Epstein. I want to be absolutely clear before we dive in, and we are going to go deep today. There is no evidence of wrongdoing by either Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton in connection with Jeffrey Epstein. That is not a disclaimer tucked away in fine print. That is a foundational fact that will anchor everything we discuss in this video. What we are covering today is a political and legal process, a constitutional showdown, a moment of real historical consequence, and a story that touches on power, accountability, reputation, and the combustible intersection of justice and politics in America. So let us start from the very beginning, because to understand what is happening today, you need to understand the full arc of how we got here. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier. He was a man who, by all outward appearances, moved through the highest levels of global society with remarkable ease. He had properties on a private island in the United States Virgin Islands, a townhouse in Manhattan that was reportedly one of the largest private residences in New York City, a ranch in New Mexico, and connections, seemingly endless connections, to politicians, royalty, celebrities, business titans, and intellectuals. For years, those connections insulated him. He was the kind of man who knew everyone and who everyone seemed to know. He attended galas, flew on private jets, and cultivated relationships with some of the most powerful people on the planet. And for a long time, the darker side of his world remained hidden, or if not hidden, then suppressed, dismissed, or quietly buried. The first cracks in that facade appeared in 2008 when Epstein reached a deeply controversial non-prosecution agreement with federal prosecutors in Florida. He pleaded guilty to state charges of soliciting prostitution from a minor. He served 13 months in a county jail with generous work release provisions that allowed him to leave for significant portions of each day. His victims were not consulted. The deal was kept secret from them in what a federal judge later ruled was a violation of their legal rights. The prosecutor who brokered that deal was Alexander Acosta, who would go on to serve as Secretary of Labor under President Donald Trump before resigning when the deal became public knowledge. For years, that 2008 deal seemed to have put the matter to rest, at least in the eyes of the law. Epstein continued his life largely undisturbed. He continued to socialize, to travel, to cultivate connections. His name appeared in flight logs, in photographs, in social circles. But the criminal machinery of the state had, for the moment, stood down. Then came 2019. Investigative journalists, particularly Julie K. Brown of the Miami Herald, had spent years digging into the 2008 deal and into Epstein's broader behavior. Their reporting was relentless and devastating. And in July of 2019, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York arrested Epstein on new charges: sex trafficking and conspiracy. The arrest sent shockwaves through powerful social circles around the world because this time it appeared there would be no quiet deal, no negotiated retreat. 1 month later, on August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City. The official ruling was suicide by hanging, but the circumstances, the broken bones in his neck, the failure of surveillance cameras, the lapses in guard monitoring, the sheer number of powerful people who had reason to fear what Epstein might say in court, fueled an extraordinary wave of conspiracy theories that has never fully subsided. His death did not end the investigation, it intensified it. And the person who became the central figure in the ongoing prosecution was Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's longtime companion and alleged co-conspirator. Maxwell was arrested in 2020, tried in 2021, and convicted in December of that year on federal charges including sex trafficking of minors. She is currently serving a 20-year prison sentence. But for many people, including members of Congress, the convictions of Epstein's associates did not answer the most pressing question. Who else knew? Who else was involved? Who else should be held accountable? Enter the House Oversight Committee. As part of a broader push to investigate the Epstein network, its connections, and the full extent of the abuse that took place, Republican members of the committee began issuing subpoenas to a range of individuals. The goal, as stated by committee leadership, was to uncover the truth about Epstein's criminal enterprise and to understand whether there were powerful figures who had knowledge of or participation in that enterprise who had never faced scrutiny. Among the names subpoenaed, Hillary Rodham Clinton and William Jefferson Clinton. Now let us be clear about the context here. The Clintons' names have appeared in the Epstein story in ways that deserve honest examination without exaggeration or unfair inference. Bill Clinton flew on Epstein's private jet, according to flight logs. He made trips to Africa as part of philanthropic work, and records indicate Epstein's plane was used. Clinton has acknowledged knowing Epstein, but has denied visiting his private island or having any knowledge of his criminal activities. Hillary Clinton has been more peripheral in the connections drawn, but she and her husband are among the most politically prominent figures in the Democratic Party, which made them natural targets for a Republican-led investigation that critics immediately labeled politically motivated. The Clintons pushed back hard. Their legal team fought the subpoenas for months, arguing that the inquiry was not a legitimate exercise of congressional oversight, but rather a partisan exercise designed to damage Democratic figures and distract from political controversies surrounding the current administration. They called the investigation a fishing expedition, a witch hunt in legal clothing, and abuse of congressional power. For months, the standoff continued. Legal motions were filed, arguments were made, and it seemed as though the matter might drag on indefinitely through the courts. Then the calculus changed. The House moved toward a bipartisan vote, and that word bipartisan is important, to hold the Clintons in criminal contempt of Congress. Contempt of Congress is not a trivial matter. It carries legal weight, reputational consequences, and the very real possibility of criminal referral. Facing that prospect, the Clintons' legal team ultimately agreed to cooperate. They would testify. And so here we are today, Thursday, February 26, 2026. Hillary Clinton is sitting before members of the House Oversight Committee in a closed-door deposition taking place in Chappaqua, New York, the town in Westchester County where she and Bill Clinton have lived since leaving the White House. The choice of location, their home turf rather than Capitol Hill, was part of the negotiated arrangement for the testimony. Closed-door depositions are a standard part of congressional investigations. They allow members to conduct detailed questioning without the circus atmosphere that comes with public hearings. Witnesses cannot play to cameras, members cannot perform for constituents, and the questioning tends to be more focused and substantive. Transcripts are typically kept confidential initially, though they can be released at the committee's discretion. In her opening statement, Clinton was direct. She said she has no new information about Epstein or about Ghislaine Maxwell. Her exact words, as reported, "I had no idea about their criminal activities. I do not recall ever encountering Mr. Epstein. I never flew on his plane or visited his island home or offices." That is about as categorical a denial as you can offer. She did not use the hedging language of someone trying to minimize or maneuver. She drew a clear line. I did not know him. I did not travel with him. I was not part of his world. She also did something that is entirely consistent with her political character. She went on offense. She accused Republicans on the committee of knowingly compelling testimony from a witness they were aware had no relevant information for the explicit purpose of political distraction. Her words, "You have compelled me to testify, fully aware that I have no knowledge that would assist your investigation in order to distract attention from President Trump's actions." That framing is pointed and deliberate. It positions the investigation not as a legitimate search for truth, but as a political maneuver, a way to keep the Epstein story in the news cycle and attach the Clinton name to it, while simultaneously drawing attention away from whatever controversies are swirling around the current administration. Whether you find that argument convincing likely depends on where you sit politically. Republicans on the committee would argue that their obligation is to follow every credible lead in the investigation, regardless of political affiliation, and that powerful people do not get a pass simply because being questioned is inconvenient or embarrassing. Democrats would argue that subpoenaing the Clintons, who have no documented role in Epstein's criminal enterprise, while there are others with far more direct connections who have faced less scrutiny, reveals the selective nature of the inquiry. Both of those arguments can be true simultaneously. That is the nature of politics. Now let us talk about the moment that briefly overshadowed the deposition itself. And if you follow congressional news at all, you will not be entirely surprised by who was at the center of it. Representative Lauren Boebert, Republican of Colorado, was present in the deposition room today. Closed-door depositions come with strict rules: no unauthorized photographs, no posting to social media, no sharing of information that has not been cleared for public release. These rules exist for a reason: to protect the integrity of the investigative process, to ensure that witnesses are not subjected to immediate public commentary before the official record is established, and to maintain the confidentiality that makes the deposition format valuable. Boebert allegedly took an unauthorized photograph of Hillary Clinton during the closed-door session and sent it to conservative influencer Benny Johnson, who then posted the image on X, formerly known as Twitter. This was a clear and acknowledged violation of House rules. The deposition was briefly paused as the disruption was addressed. The exact consequences for Boebert, if any, are forthcoming or remain to be seen. House rules violations can result in sanctions ranging from formal reprimand to censure, though enforcement tends to be inconsistent and often follows partisan lines. What the incident did, regardless of intent, was inject a moment of chaotic energy into what was already one of the most politically charged depositions in recent memory. It also raised immediate questions about the seriousness and professionalism of the investigative process, questions that critics of the inquiry were quick to amplify. Supporters of the investigation would note that one member's behavior does not invalidate the entire inquiry. Critics would argue that it speaks to the underlying motivations of those who are most enthusiastically driving the process. Either way, the photograph exists, the post exists, and the violation of House rules is documented. What happens next is up to House leadership. Let us spend a moment on the months-long legal battle that preceded today's deposition, because it tells us a great deal about how high the stakes had been perceived on all sides. When the subpoenas were first issued, the Clintons' legal team moved quickly to challenge them. Their arguments were several. First, they argued that the subpoenas exceeded the legitimate scope of congressional oversight, that Congress has the power to investigate matters for the purpose of potential legislation, not to conduct what amounts to a criminal investigation of private citizens. Second, they argued that the political nature of the inquiry, driven by Republican members with an obvious interest in damaging Democratic figures, rendered it constitutionally suspect. Third, they challenged the procedural basis for the specific subpoenas. These are not frivolous arguments. They reflect genuine and unresolved tensions in American constitutional law about the extent of congressional subpoena power. Courts have been reluctant to step in and limit congressional investigations, generally deferring to the legislative branch's broad authority to gather information relevant to its functions. The Clintons' legal team filed motions, sought delays, and engaged in the kind of procedural gamesmanship that well-resourced legal defense always involves. For several months, the matter wound its way through the legal system without clear resolution. The turning point, as we noted earlier, was the threat of criminal contempt, when the House moved toward a bipartisan vote, meaning it was not purely a partisan Republican action, but had at least some Democratic support or abstention. To hold the Clintons in contempt, the legal and political calculus shifted. Criminal contempt of Congress carries real consequences, and more importantly, it transforms the narrative. Refusing to testify becomes the story, rather than whatever the testimony might or might not reveal. Suddenly, the optics of defiance outweigh the risks of compliance. The agreement to testify was accompanied presumably by negotiations over the conditions, location, scope of questioning, the presence of attorneys, and other procedural protections. Those kinds of arrangements are standard in congressional depositions of high-profile witnesses. And so Chappaqua, New York became the unlikely setting for a moment that historians will likely spend years analyzing. Let us step back from the immediate political drama and think about what this moment actually represents. Hillary Clinton is a former First Lady, a former United States Senator from New York, a former Secretary of State, and the Democratic nominee for President of the United States in 2016. She is one of the most scrutinized public figures of the past 3 decades. She has appeared before Congress before, and most notably in the lengthy Benghazi hearings that consumed an enormous amount of congressional time and attention in the years following the 2012 attacks on the American diplomatic compound in Libya. She sat through 11 hours of that hearing in 2015. Today's deposition is different in kind, if not in intensity. The Benghazi hearings were public, televised, and part of an investigation that directly touched on her conduct as Secretary of State. The Epstein deposition is closed door and touches on a matter in which she has, by her own account and by the available evidence, no direct involvement. But symbolically, the image of Hillary Clinton testifying under congressional subpoena in connection with the Jeffrey Epstein investigation carries an enormous charge in the current political environment. It is a story that generates clicks, engagement, and strong reactions across the political spectrum. It activates pre-existing narratives and grievances. It is, in the language of political communication, a highly resonant event. Her decision to come out swinging in her opening statement, to immediately reframe the deposition as a political attack rather than a legitimate inquiry, is consistent with the combative political identity she has maintained throughout her career. She did not come in apologetically, she did not hedge, she made her denial, and then she made her accusation. Whether that approach serves the cause of public understanding, or whether it simply deepens the partisan divide around an investigation that many people believe deserves genuine nonpartisan scrutiny, is a question worth sitting with. Now let us turn to what is coming next, because in some ways tomorrow may be an even more significant moment. Bill Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States, is scheduled to testify before the House Oversight Committee tomorrow, Friday, February 27, 2026, in the same location in Chappaqua. According to reporting, this will be the first time a former President of the United States has been forced to testify before Congress. Let that sink in for a moment. In the entire history of the United States, across more than 2 centuries, across dozens of former presidents, through wars and scandals and investigations of every kind, we have apparently never before had a former commander-in-chief compelled by congressional subpoena to sit before a committee and answer questions under oath. That is a genuinely remarkable moment, regardless of your political views about the Clintons or about the investigation itself. The connections between Bill Clinton and Jeffrey Epstein have been more extensively documented than those involving Hillary Clinton. Flight logs from Epstein's private planes have included Bill Clinton's name. He has acknowledged flying on Epstein's aircraft for philanthropic travel, but has denied visiting Epstein's private island in the Virgin Islands. His office, over the years, has issued statements attempting to characterize the relationship as a limited and ultimately regretted association. Whether those explanations will satisfy committee members tomorrow, or whether the questioning will attempt to push into territory that the former president's legal team considers outside the bounds of the investigation, remains to be seen. What we can say with confidence is that tomorrow's testimony will be among the most closely watched events of the year. Every word will be parsed, every exchange will be analyzed, and the political reverberations will be felt for a long time to come. One of the most persistent and legitimate criticisms of the House Oversight Committee's investigation is the question of scope. The Epstein network was not a small or partisan thing. The flight logs of Epstein's planes, which have been the subject of extensive journalistic investigation, included names from across the political spectrum: Democrats and Republicans, Americans and foreign nationals, politicians and entertainers, and business figures and academics. If the investigation is genuinely about uncovering the full truth of the Epstein network and ensuring that all those who had knowledge of or participated in criminal activity are held accountable, then the list of witnesses should reflect that breadth. Critics have argued that the Republican-led committee has shown considerably more enthusiasm for subpoenaing Democratic figures than for pursuing equally prominent connections on the Republican side of the ledger. This is not a minor critique. The legitimacy of a congressional investigation depends, at least in part, on its even-handedness. An investigation that appears designed to pursue political opponents while protecting political allies is not a genuine search for truth. It is a political operation wearing the costume of oversight. Defenders of the investigation would push back and say that the committee must start somewhere, that they are following the evidence as they understand it, and that accusations of partisan selectivity are themselves a form of political deflection. The truth, as is so often the case, probably lies in complicated territory that neither straightforward defense nor straightforward attack fully captures. What the public deserves, and what genuine justice for Epstein's victims requires, is an investigation that is comprehensive, credible, and clearly committed to accountability, regardless of political affiliation. Whether this investigation meets that standard is a judgment that each person will have to make based on the evolving record. In the noise and drama of political combat, it is easy to lose sight of the people who are at the center of this story, not as political symbols, not as legal abstractions, but as human beings. The women who were trafficked, abused, and exploited by Jeffrey Epstein and his associates, the young girls who were victimized, the survivors who have spent years and decades seeking some measure of justice and acknowledgement. Their stories were told painstakingly and courageously by journalists and in court proceedings and in their own voices whenever they were given the opportunity. Their pain is real. Their desire for accountability is entirely legitimate. They deserve a reckoning that is proportionate to what was done to them and to what was done for so long to protect the man who did it. Some of Epstein's victims have settled civil claims against his estate. Some have spoken publicly. Some are still fighting in courts. Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction brought some measure of accountability to one of the central figures in the network. But for many survivors, the conviction of Maxwell, while meaningful, does not represent the full accounting they are owed. They want to know who else knew. They want to know who else was complicit. They want the powerful people who socialized with Epstein, who flew on his planes and attended his parties, to have to answer publicly and under oath what they knew and when they knew it. That is a legitimate demand, and it is worth noting that the congressional investigation, whatever its political motivations, exists within that context. The question of whether it is pursuing that goal faithfully and even-handedly is separate from the question of whether the goal itself is right and necessary. The survivors' voices should be at the center of this story. They have too often been crowded out by political noise. Let us zoom out one more time and look at the broader political landscape that provides the backdrop for today's events. We are in a period of intense partisan polarization. Congressional oversight has become, to a significant degree, a weapon in the ongoing conflict between the two major parties. When Republicans control the House, they investigate Democratic officials and affiliated figures. When Democrats control the House, they investigate Republican officials and affiliated figures. The machinery of oversight, subpoenas, depositions, public hearings, contempt citations, has become part of the partisan arsenal. This is not entirely new. Congressional investigations have always had political dimensions, but the intensity, the frequency, and the brazenness of politically motivated investigations have escalated dramatically in recent years, to the point where the public has become genuinely uncertain about which investigations represent legitimate oversight and which are political theater. The Epstein investigation sits in this contested space. There are real questions to be answered about the Epstein network, real connections to be examined, real accountability to be sought. At the same time, the specific decisions made by the House Oversight Committee about whom to subpoena, whom to prioritize, and how to conduct the investigation have invited serious and credible criticism about partisan motivation. Hillary Clinton's framing in her opening statement that the deposition is designed to distract from President Trump's actions points toward the contemporary political context without specifying what those actions are. It is a frame that resonates with Democratic voters who are deeply suspicious of this investigation and everything surrounding it. For Republican supporters of the investigation, the response would be that Clinton's attempt to pivot to Trump is itself a distraction, that being questioned about her connections to an Epstein-adjacent social world is not inherently political, and that powerful people of all affiliations should be willing to account for their associations. Both of those arguments will continue to be made loudly and passionately in the hours and days ahead. It is worth spending a moment on how the media is covering these events, because the way a story is framed shapes how people understand it. Conservative media outlets have tended to cover the Epstein investigation and the Clinton depositions specifically with considerable enthusiasm. For outlets and commentators who have long been skeptical of the Clintons, the image of Hillary Clinton compelled to testify, even in a closed-door setting, even denying any knowledge, is a meaningful moment. It puts the Clinton name in the same sentence as Epstein in a news context in the year 2026. That has value within a particular political ecosystem. Mainstream and liberal-leaning media outlets have tended to provide more contextual framing, noting the lack of evidence of wrongdoing, emphasizing the political nature of the investigation, and highlighting the Boebert photograph incident as evidence of the circus atmosphere surrounding the proceedings. Social media, as always, amplifies the most extreme versions of every frame simultaneously. Conspiracy theories flourish on platforms where nuance is penalized and outrage is rewarded. The image that Boebert allegedly sent to Benny Johnson, posted on X, will circulate through networks that have long believed the worst about the Clintons, and will be used to argue all manner of things that the available evidence does not support. The challenge for anyone trying to understand what is actually happening today is to hold multiple things in mind simultaneously: the genuine and ongoing importance of accountability in the Epstein case, the real and documented politicization of this particular investigation, the absence of evidence of wrongdoing by the Clintons specifically, and the legitimate questions that remain unanswered about who knew what and when. Good journalism requires that kind of complexity. Good citizenship requires it too. So, what happens after today? What comes after tomorrow's testimony from Bill Clinton? Where does this investigation go from here? Several threads are likely to develop simultaneously. First, the committee will presumably analyze the testimony from both Clintons. If either provides information that opens new investigative avenues, names, dates, connections that the committee was not previously aware of, those avenues may be pursued. If, as seems likely given Hillary Clinton's opening statement, both Clintons assert that they have no relevant knowledge, the committee will have to decide whether to accept that or to attempt to challenge it with contradictory evidence. Second, the question of whether the transcripts from these depositions will be made public will become a flashpoint. Both parties will have interests in either releasing or suppressing specific portions of the record. Leaks, authorized and unauthorized, are virtually inevitable. Third, the Boebert photograph incident will generate its own investigation and potential consequences. House rules exist for a reason, and the question of whether there are meaningful consequences for violating them has implications well beyond this particular case. Fourth, the political ramifications of the depositions, however they ultimately play out, will be incorporated into the broader narratives of both parties. Democrats will argue that the investigation produced nothing because there was nothing to find regarding the Clintons. Republicans will argue that the process of compelling testimony was itself valuable and that the investigation is ongoing. Fifth, and most importantly from the standpoint of actual justice, the broader Epstein accountability story will continue regardless of the congressional proceedings. Civil litigation, ongoing journalism, and potential additional criminal proceedings related to other members of Epstein's network will keep the underlying story alive. Before we close, let us sit for a moment with the genuine historical weight of what we are witnessing. A former Secretary of State and First Lady testifying under congressional subpoena in her home in Chappaqua. A former president scheduled to follow her tomorrow in what will be an unprecedented moment in American history. A congressional investigation touching on one of the most disturbing criminal enterprises of the modern era, a political system so fractured that virtually no institution retains the universal trust needed to make truth-seeking exercises broadly credible. Whatever you think of the Clintons, whatever you think of the Republican members driving this investigation, whatever you think of the Epstein story and how it has been handled by the press and the political establishment, this is a moment that reflects something real and important about where America is right now. The country is grappling imperfectly and contentiously with questions about power and accountability. It is trying in its messy and partisan and often infuriating way to figure out how to hold powerful people to account for what they know and what they do. The mechanisms for doing that, congressional oversight, criminal prosecution, civil litigation, journalism, are all strained and contested and distrusted by significant portions of the public. And yet here we are. A congressional committee issued subpoenas, a legal battle was fought and ultimately resolved. A former Secretary of State is sitting in Chappaqua telling members of Congress under oath that she does not know what they want her to know. Tomorrow her husband will sit in the same room and do the same. Whether that process is producing justice, real justice, the kind that means something to the women who were trafficked and abused by Jeffrey Epstein, is the question that should hang over all of it. The political theater is real, the partisan motivations are real, and the underlying demand for accountability, the demand that comes from survivors and from a public that watched a massively wealthy and connected man abuse children for decades with apparent impunity, that is real too. None of those truths cancels the others. As we wrap up today's coverage, here is what we know for certain. Hillary Clinton has testified before the House Oversight Committee in a closed-door deposition in Chappaqua, New York. She has categorically denied any knowledge of Jeffrey Epstein's criminal activities, denied ever meeting him, and denied flying on his plane or visiting his island. She has characterized the investigation as a politically motivated distraction. There is no evidence of wrongdoing by Hillary Clinton in connection with Epstein. Representative Lauren Boebert violated House rules by taking and disseminating an unauthorized photograph from the closed-door session. The deposition was briefly paused as a result. Tomorrow, Bill Clinton will testify in the same location, making history as the first former president of the United States to be compelled to testify before Congress. The full implications of these depositions, and politically, legally, historically, will take time to become clear. The transcripts may or may not be released. The investigation will continue. The political battles around it will continue. And the underlying story of Jeffrey Epstein, his victims, and the question of full accountability for his network will continue to demand attention and action. This is a story that is not over, not by a long way. Thank you for watching. If you found this coverage valuable, please share it with someone who wants to understand what is actually happening. Not just the headlines, but the full picture. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read all of them, and we will be back tomorrow with full coverage of Bill Clinton's historic testimony. Stay informed, stay critical, and stay with us.